Welcome to today's webinar with RAND Group, and our topic is improving productivity with Dynamics GP workflow automation. My name is Gina Santos, and I'll be your presenter today. Just a quick intro on myself. I'm one of the directors of the ERP practice here at RAND Group. And I've been with RAND for about 2.5 years now, but I have over 20 years of experience in both consulting and industry. I have a certification as an ERP implementation consultant across multiple ERP solutions, such as Dynamics GP and SAP by design. And in my experience in the industry, I too was an ERP user, so I have sat on both sides of the desk, so to speak. And whenever I'm asked if I like working as a consultant, I certainly do. I really do love working with clients and the opportunity to help clients to improve their daily lives. It's what I call my noble purpose in life and in my professional life, and using technology and efficient processes is one way that we can make the workday a little easier and a little better for our clients. And that's always my end goal. So with that intro out of the way, let's go through our agenda for today's webinar. We'll start with going over some housekeeping and admin items here. And since we do have a mix of attendees, as I see on the attendees list, of different attendees, and some of you may not be as familiar with RAND Group, we'll do a quick introduction of our company. And that'll be followed by our main topic for today, which is the GP workflow automation. Then we'll talk about next steps that you can take as you get started about thinking of workflow automation. And then finally, we will address any questions you may have. So on the housekeeping items, as I mentioned, we do have a good number of folks on the call here. So all attendees will be in listen-only mode. So we can avoid any issues with background noise or any other unintended interruptions. And we're also going to ask you to type in your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar panel. So just make sure that you're typing it in the question box and not the chat box, so I can address them at the end of the webinar. So in the interest of keeping the flow of the presentation, we want to ask you to hold the questions. You can put them in the question box anytime, but we are going to address them at the end of the webinar. And if for some reason we run out of time, then we can proceed with giving you answers through email if we can't address them today. We have the marketing team that's going to make sure that we close the loop on some of these questions that we didn't get to answer. And also, if you do have specific workflow design questions that are specific to your business case or use case, we would love to address those as well, if not on this webinar, but we can address them following the session. And the final housekeeping item is that this webinar is being recorded, and it'll be available for you for future reference. So we'll get started by doing a poll question here. And we always encourage participation and feedback during the webinar, so this is one way that we could do it. So as a warm-up question, we're hoping that you can participate and answer the first question. Still a warm-up, just an icebreaker for everyone. And the question is, what is your favorite Thanksgiving side dish, right? So since we're coming up on Thanksgiving, we just want to see if we can practice doing the poll. I've published the poll, and your choices are mashed potatoes, green beans, sweet potatoes, we've got stuffing with cranberry sauce, or corn. So I'll give you 10 more seconds to put in your response to the poll question. Okay. Looks like most people have answered. We have 94% of the people have answered the poll. Last call for a response. All right, and we'll go ahead and close the poll. And I'll share the results here. And you'll see that the stuffing with cranberry sauce was the winner with 41%, followed by mashed potatoes for 24%, 35% for sweet potatoes, and green beans and corn just did not get any votes. So thank you so much for participating. So now we know the poll is working for us. Hopefully you can participate in the other polls that we do provide here. So let's see, let's make sure that we are sharing my screen again. And we are going to proceed with the next item on our agenda, which is the RAND Group introduction. So some of you may already know that we were founded in 2003 and we're based out of Houston, Texas. And just with any professional services firm, our main asset is our employees. Across our teams, we have consultants and resources that have significant work experience, and they have professional credentials such as CPAs and MBAs. And many of us have also worked in industry, as I mentioned earlier. So that brings another layer of expertise and experience that we bring to the table for our clients. We also have expertise across multiple platforms, be it Microsoft, Oracle, or SAP. And based on this very diverse product offerings, we have serviced over 500 clients and we have over 2,500 successful engagements. And because of our methodologies and our track record, we do have a lot of clients that stay with us. And so we have over 90% of client retention. And because of our experience with implementation and client support, we do have a lot of clients that come to us after they've worked with another partner, after they've worked with someone else with a failed or poor implementation, and we've given them ongoing product support and services. So our mission is to help people use technology for business success. So we feel like a software system that is aligned with your business and works with the team to reduce frustration, increase usability, make the company more connected and more productive is our main goal. And we've grown over the last few years here, and that we've added more product offerings and services, starting with the ERP, CRM, and e-commerce options. We do provide services in the cloud and infrastructure arena as well. We participate and provide clients with digital marketing and website services. And we do also application development. And most recently, we added a data sciences team that does analytics and dashboards for us. Okay. So now let's go on to our main topic here, which is the GP workflow automation. The topics that we're going to cover is just to do a quick intro and define what is workflow automation. And then we'll talk about the workflow feature in GP, talk about the types of workflow that you could implement in GP, the users and approvals that could be set up, the notifications, approval steps, and conditions. So what is the industry definition? And you'll see a lot of them out in the web, right? But one of the definitions that I really like is workflow automation is the design, execution, and automation of processes based on workflow rules, where you take all the human tasks, all the data, and all the files, how they're routed and processed between people and systems based on the predefined business rules. So as a practical example, think of your process for your intake of AP invoices, right? Everybody has AP invoices that they need to handle in their organization. They're typically routed between employees so they can confirm that the AP invoice is correct and accurate before the vendor is paid. This is typically a very manual, paper-based system, and that takes a lot of time and sometimes a lot of corrections along the way. Is it the right amount? Was it posted to the correct expense account? Was the expenditure even authorized? So by implementing an automated workflow for AP invoices, you can get the benefits of workflow automation, which in very simple terms would be work less and do more. So why are companies very eager to automate their workflows? So here are some of the many benefits of workflow automation, starting with reducing the paperwork. In our example, you take the paper invoice, you route it manually, you store it in a physical location. And if you do workflow automation, the alternative is you get a paperless environment where the invoices are scanned into the ERP, reviewed by approvers electronically, and ERP users have ready access to that invoice at their fingertips. Increased productivity. So it's been published that office workers spend an average of 69 days per year on mundane tasks. So workflow automation takes away that time-consuming task of chasing down approvals, looking up paper-based records, and put everything electronically. The other benefit is to reduce the errors. So eliminating errors is really pretty close to impossible to do, but setting up a review and approval on records and transactions really allows users to be proactive and prevent errors from occurring in the first place when we have this automation. Another benefit is increasing transparency and control. So workflow automation defines the duties and responsibilities of each role very clearly. And there's greater control over data accessibility and approval information. And then lastly, but it's really not, these are not the only 5 benefits of workflow automation, but I would say they would be the top 5 that I would pick. But collaboration with teammates in multiple locations. So a lot of us have offices that are spread out across geographic regions. So this has always been a benefit to clients with teams in multiple locations. But this resonates with all of us in today's reality where a lot of us are working remotely more than ever. And this has become a critical piece of maintaining productivity in this day and age, especially with the pandemic. And so even one of our GP clients called us in the beginning of the whole pandemic and asked us for assistance with setting up workflow for their AP invoices because his team was all working remotely and they could not get to processing the invoices in a timely manner. So that's a prime example of why people would want to collaborate using workflow automation. So as a result, we introduced the workflow feature in GP to that client. So what is that workflow feature in Dynamics GP? So I'll introduce the first poll question, number 1, and it is, do you currently use the workflow feature in Dynamics GP? So I'll go ahead and publish, and hopefully you can participate. And please answer if it's yes or no. I'll give you a few more seconds here. Okay, 5 more seconds to close the loop. We have almost everyone participating here. Okay, great. I'll go ahead and close the poll question and share the results. And you'll see that an overwhelming 94% of our attendees today do not use the workflow feature in GP. And the workflow feature in GP has been around since GP 2013. So we are excited that you are part of this webinar so we can talk about it a little bit more and see if it could work for your organization. So let's share my presentation again. I think my screen is frozen here for a second here. Let me see. Here we go. So the workflow feature in GP. So the workflow feature allows you to define and configure workflows for some of Dynamics GP processes. You can do workflows on master records, user records, transactions, and even transaction batches. So workflow is actually something that you could set up using the administration task to set it up, to enable it for email, and to enable you to push emails for action for the GP users and workflow participants. So the second poll question that we have is true or false? Do GP users have to purchase the workflow feature to add this tool to their GP solution? So I'll publish that and let's see what the general consensus is on this. Great, we'll give you 10 more seconds to weigh in. Okay, great. So let me share this. And as you can see, 81% of you think that you don't have to purchase the workflow feature to add this tool, and the 81% of you are correct. So one of the great things about the workflow is that it is included in your GP solution. So you can go into your administration page right now. You can probably see it under setup, under system and company, and you will see that the workflow feature is already installed with your GP solution. It doesn't even need an additional installation to be part of your GP solution. So what types of workflows are there? There are available workflows in Dynamics GP. And as I mentioned, a workflow feature was rolled out in GP 2013 to start with, but I'll give you a rundown of the different workflow types that are available in GP 2016 R2. So that's a roll-up of everything that was available from 2013 up to GP 2016 R2. And I start here because this is the oldest version of GP that is supported right now under mainstream support. And under GP 2016 R2, you have purchase requisitions and orders that are available under workflow. You can have workflow activated for payables, transactions, and batches. You have them for payroll, for your employee profile, skills and training, time and attendance and direct deposit. In project accounting, you have them for project timesheets and expenses. And vendor master records are also in this version, as well as general ledger batches. But you'll see that there's a commonality in what they rolled out first and foremost would be all the different workflow processes that touch more than GP users. Most of these features that they've offered in this version are workflows that need the participation of users outside of the accounting team, whether they're department managers, supervisors, or the like. In 2018 R2, they added more types of workflows. They added purchasing receipts, purchasing invoices, sales transactions, and general ledger accounts. And I am going to start sharing my screen again. I'm sorry, I don't think I shared my screen. Okay. So on your screen, you should be seeing now my presentation and the slide that shows the available workflows in 2016 R2 and 2018 R2. And lastly, in the modern GP, they've added more of system-related workflow types, such as users, security roles, security task, and user security that you could set up with a workflow. As I mentioned earlier, and I want to emphasize it again, we do have a lot of the processes that involve more than just the GP user that have been included as part of the types of workflows available in GP. So in GP, you could actually set up a workflow definition for each of these types of workflows. You'll see that you can go into the workflow maintenance window in GP under the administration menu, And you can set up a workflow definition for each of the types of workflow, whether it's a payable batch, the payables transaction batch, purchase order, purchase requisition. These are all the ones that belong to purchasing. And if you change your drop down for the series, you would see all the other types of workflows available in those series. You'll see in this workflow definition that the definition itself contains the workflow name and the description, the status of it, if it's active or not. And what this means is that you can have as many workflow definitions for each type of workflow, but you can only activate one. So if for some reason you made some changes to an existing workflow, you can inactivate that and activate the one with the modified workflow definitions. You have some workflow steps, whether they've got one approval or multiple approval steps. Then you've got the options for notifications and approvals. And then you've got options for what you want the workflow to do when a task is overdue, right? In our example, we have an invoice approval for payables transactions, and that's for approval of AP invoices. And we want a first approval where PM transaction current amount is a certain amount. It needs to be approved. Our options are to make sure that we send notifications for any completed actions on this approval workflow. And we want the originator or the person who submitted the AP invoice to also be an approver. And in this example, we have when a task is overdue, they can actually escalate it to another user, to one specific user that can do the approval. Along with the definition, you have to define your workflow steps. So with each definition, you can have as many steps as you want under each definition. The workflow steps are defined by the conditions that have to be met so that you would use that approval step, the assignments of who would be the approver, any time limits that are associated with this approval step, and then the notifications that will be sent out for the assignment of this approval step, and lastly, the completion policy. So in this example, we have an AP invoice that will go out to this approver if it is less than or equal to 5,000, and it's assigned to our user, RG demo user 3, and this user has 8 hours to approve this. They will get a reminder 4 hours into that time, and they will get a message sent to them for this action item. Now, given that bit of information for now, let's go to our last poll question, which is which type of workflow would be of greatest interest to your organization? So there's no right or wrong answer here. So I'm going to publish that poll and let us know which type of workflow would be of greatest interest to your organization. Okay, 5 more seconds. Great. All right, and I'll go ahead and close the voting now, and I'll share the results. And overwhelmingly, 82% of you selected the purchasing series and the purchasing workflows, while 18% chose the general ledger batches and accounts. So this is not surprising at all. In all the GP clients that we've helped so far to do workflows, most of them are in the purchasing series. And the reason behind that is because a lot of users that are non-GP users are usually part of that purchasing workflow that they need to do the review and approval of those transactions. So let's dig into the whole setup of users and who can participate in the GP workflow. And I'll make sure to share my screen. Okay. So let's talk about workflow users. So GP users and those are the employees who are set up as GP users, can enter records to submit for workflow processes. They can also approve records in GP. So, as an example, for a payables transaction entry window, when there is an approval workflow activated for payables transaction entry or AP invoices, your GP user can enter an invoice in the system. This gray visual cue tells them that the invoice approval is activated for this type of workflow and that they can submit this transaction for approval. Also, the GP users can view the workflow history. So in the payables transaction entry window, once they do submit that AP invoice, then you can view the history and click on the View History action button, which gives you a view of the workflow history, and it'll give you dates and times and the actual users that took those actions related to this workflow. And you're probably going to ask next, what about the non-GP users? So employees who are non-GP users may also be configured as workflow approvers in Dynamics GP. They can't necessarily be the originator since they can't be in GP to enter transactions, but they can be set up to be workflow approvers of your workflow. So as an example, for our payables transaction workflow, we could assign a non-GP user as the approver, and you'll see that the selected user is actually an Active Directory account that we're using. So if we have an Active Directory account that we could set up as a non-GP user, they could be an approver for your workflows. There's no additional licensing involved, and there's no additional cost for setting up these Active Directory accounts as GP workflow approvers. So the non-GP users will get to approve or reject records, and based on the configuration of the workflow, they can delegate approvals to another approver. They can do this through an email. So if they were a non-GP user, what they would get is an email sent to their email address. They do have the option to look at the attachments related to that payables transaction, and they can open up the attachment from that email. And from this email too, they can see that they've been assigned a task to approve a payables transaction entry, and they have a task deadline, and they have the ability to view the document if they are a GP user. So this blue link allows them to drill back to GP and open up that window where they can see the invoice entry. But even if they're not a GP user, they could, from this email, take action and say approve, reject, or even delegate. Some of the information is here where it's a document type, the actual number, the vendor itself, document date, and the amount. And there are some comments that came in from the people who were the originators of this invoice. So these are the different notifications that come in. Let's dig a little bit into the notifications that you can set up in GP Workflow. So the notifications are available to send to all workflow users. They will receive them through the workflow notifications via email. So you could send emails that tell the approvers and the users that something has been submitted, that it's ready for action. So all of the different steps of your workflow can have different notifications associated with them. Workflows may be configured to send email notifications for any of the actions in the process. And so as an example, back to our AP invoice approval, you can actually send notifications for any of the completed actions. And if you open up this detail button here in your workflow maintenance window, it'll open up your notification maintenance window. These are all the different notifications that can be notified to the originator so that they know what is the status of the invoice that they've submitted for approval. These are the messages that can be can be configured in the system, and you can also send carbon copies of the email to a user or a group of users. So there's 3 things that you have to set up to be able to send out workflow notifications. The first is the email setup. You can enable emails for workflow, and you'll need to install and configure the GP web services. You can do that in the workflow setup and make sure that you've got it set up for your domain. And you also need to set up your calendar. So you can define your workflow calendar for time limits and reminder email settings in the workflow definitions. As an example, here might be a workflow calendar for 2020 that dictates the different work days of the week, as well as the non-work days based on your holiday schedule for your organization. This workflow calendar will be used to calculate the actual time limit that your approver is given, and it's also going to be used for the reminders that get sent to your approvers and to your workflow users. By applying the workflow calendar, it will use this schedule to send out those notifications and actions. And then the last thing you need to do is the email message setup itself. So you can define the actual email message that's associated with each workflow action or each approval step. So in our example, we had a message that was going out to the approver, to RG demo user 3. And this is a message that can be crafted and worded in a way that would be meaningful to your organization. In this case, this is the email that goes out to the approver saying they have a task that's been assigned to them and what the task deadline is and what the document type and document details are. And so this is something that can be modified and tweaked according to your preference. So one of the things that you could look at are the approval steps and start planning that ahead of time to understand what kind of approval steps are needed to run through the workflow process. So when you define an approval step for the workflow process, you have to define it. As an example, you have a purchase order approval. You need to be able to define the different approval steps. So in our example, maybe a PO subtotal is the basis for an approval. Anything less than or equal to 2,000 would be going to the first approver. Anything between 2K and 5K goes to the second, and then anything over 5K would be a third. This would be an example of defining your approval steps for a workflow process. And then what you could do is set up those approvals in your workflow definition, that you now have these 3 steps, the 2K approval, the 5K approval, and the over 5K approval. In our example, depending on the PO amount, it's going to run through either step number 1 or step number 2 or step number 3. You do have the option to have approval steps that go from one to the other. So you have the option to say, if it's just 2K, then you can just go to the first approval. If it's over 2K, you can go to the first and second approval. And then if it's over 5K, then you need all 3 approvals. That's definitely one that you could also set up and configure in GP workflow. In the conditions, you can actually define your approval steps based on the conditions of your transaction or your record. So conditions can be defined using one or more of the fields that are available in each record. And just to illustrate that a little bit more, let's use that same example of the purchase order, where we said that the PO needs to be approved based on the PO subtotal amount. And you'll see that this condition says this workflow manager needs to approve this purchase order when it's greater than $5,000. If I look at the details of the condition, I can actually select any of the fields that are available on that purchase order record, whether it's the PO type, the subtotal, maybe the vendor ID, vendor name. So you'll see in this dropdown that there's a lot of different fields that are available to define the condition that's going to trigger that approval step. That's true of all the different types of workflows, and they have all these different fields that are available for each of the different processes. Okay. So the next step is really, it's a great tool. I'd really like to get it started, and it's already part of the GP installation. So how do I get started with this? So one of the things that we would tell you is that you would plan for your workflow automation. First, you can identify a process or a couple of processes that could benefit from automation. For this, you can hone in on a process that could benefit from it. Has to be a process that can be mature or something that you can define. And it could be defined enough so that you can implement it in the workflow. It might help to start by drawing up a flow diagram to get a better understanding of the current workflow and identify those repetitive tasks and the players in the process. The second is define your goals and expectations. It's always the question of why. Why would you engage in implementing a feature or a system or an automation? So the benefits can be very different based on the process that you're automating. You could look at, is it going to increase your ROI? Is it going to increase team productivity? Is it going to have greater transparency and auditability in your approvals? So you need to start defining the goals and expectations so you understand and keep in mind why you're doing the automation. The third would be to socialize that automation with your process owners. Part of the buy-in is to make sure that you can achieve the implementation of the workflow and the success of it, just to make sure that you have the buy-in and make sure that you can communicate to all the stakeholders and the process owners and the process participants what the benefits are for automating the process, and encourage them to provide feedback and provide input. Once you have that, then you can design that workflow. It means defining the actual process, possibly the approval rules, the routings, the delegation of authority for each step of the workflow, and then the users that are going to participate in each step of the process. Then you can go ahead and implement the workflow automation. So GP is a great way to have it's a pretty small lift considering that you already have it in your system and that you have users that you can use both GP and non-GP that can participate in the workflow automation. And finally, the step is to begin measuring KPIs and ROIs, that you can measure how successful and how effective the workflow is, whether that be measuring the user experience and making it better for your users, or increasing the satisfaction of the work culture and being able to communicate better and collaborate better across your team members. Okay. So with that, I will open it up to questions. So if you have any questions, you can type them in the questions box. So I'll give you a few minutes to type in your answers. Questions. Okay, the first one is, I want to make sure that I see all of them. Let me see if I can expand this, because I see a few questions, but I can't see them in total. Okay, the first question is, do invoices need to be attached in GP? So it's not a requirement to have attachments in GP. It is highly recommended though, because it allows you to scan in that invoice and associate that invoice with that workflow item. And it then is available for approvers and task owners to view that invoice as the basis for approval and review of that specific transaction. So even if it's not required, it's highly recommended. So thank you for that question. All right. And I wish I could expand this, but I don't. Let's see. Okay, the next question is, the links in the email can be a high risk for security breaches. What kind of security is in place? And that's a great question. I think that's something that we could look at a little bit more. I don't know exactly what security security measures are in place for that, but we can certainly look. Hopefully it is. One of the limitations is that the users that can be part of this process are all in your own domain. So you can only set up emails and Active Directory accounts that are within your domain, within your network domain. So hopefully that's enough of a security measure so that you don't have any kind of outside users or outside emails and accounts that are part of this process. And I hope that answered your question. But if it didn't, please send me an email and we can talk about it a little bit more. The next question is, when I create the workflow, can I add or delete steps to it once it's active? All right, it's another great question. So when you do have an active workflow and there are pending transactions to it, then you will not be able to add or delete steps at that point in time. You will have to clear all of the different transactions that are part of that type of workflow and then be able to make the changes at that time. Okay. Okay, see a few more questions here. Just want to make sure I didn't miss any up top. My apologies. Okay. See one here. It says, are workflows set up by company? If yes, can I copy workflow to another company? So the answer is yes. Each workflow definition that you create is specific to that company. But just in the more recent version of workflow, they rolled out the functionality to copy the workflow from one company to another. And then what you can do is once you've copied it to the other company, you can make the changes as needed, whether it's the approvals or the users that are participating in that workflow in the other company. So the answer is yes, you can copy it from one company to the other. Okay. The other question is, can I send comments back when I'm an approver and I'm approving or rejecting from the email? So the answer is yes. Even when you're in the email functionality of the workflow feature, when you click on approve or reject or delegate, there will be a pop-up window that comes up and then you can enter your comments, and the comments will be kept in that record in GP and it will be sent back to the originators and all the users that are set up to get that response back. Okay, and one more question here, and I think we've touched on this. Can users on other multiple domains be set up as approvers in one GP application? So right now, only the users in the same domain can be part of the GP workflow solution. It's just a limitation for now, and that you have the same domain in your workflow email setup. So that's also part of that question earlier about security, where you will not have anybody outside of your domain be part of the workflow process. So it's a great advantage, but at the same time, if you have people on a different domain, perhaps you can have them set up with an alias or another forwarding email that's part of the domain that's used in GP. Okay. All right, I'm trying to scroll through and I don't see any other questions. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I want to thank you for being part of our webinar today. If you have any questions, you can definitely send them to me by email or send me or call me on my direct line. I have it on the screen right now. So if you have any questions, certainly give us a call or email us. Thank you again so much for your time and have a great day.